So today we continue our look at atonement, of course, and today we had a little bit of a shorter reading. We're building up to some major events that happen in the course of the story, and as we've seen so far, things have been building gradually, slowly. We've been learning about who our main characters are. Bryony, of course, Cecilia, Robbie, right? And our central sort of three characters. We've seen something about like how they think, where they are, what stage they're at in their lives, what kinds of hopes and dreams that they have, right? We've seen that, you know, Bryony is sort of on the edge of childhood, and that she's sort of kind of immature, but at the same time newly interested in adult things, especially because of her writing. Cecilia has just graduated from Cambridge University, and she doesn't know what she's going to do with her life. Is she going to get a job? Is she going to get married? Like, her future seems very much up in the air, uncertain at that point. And of course, Robbie, he has firmly decided what he is going to do, even though he got the highest possible grades for his English literature degree at Cambridge. He's decided he's going to become a doctor, right? And we saw last time how McEwan builds up these characters, builds up their ideas about the future and their hopes and dreams, about their possible future selves, about what might happen to them as they imagine it in the future, as we looked at last time. Within the story, of course, we see that like our story so far has taken place in the course of one day, right? Beginning with the expected arrival of the twins and the hoped-for production of the Trials of Arabella and all that sort of stuff. And then as we moved into the evening part of the story, we saw leading into that, right, that Robbie gives Bryony the letter for Cecilia, and of course he includes the wrong one, right, the one that has the sort of sexually explicit message to her that he didn't mean to send. And we concluded last time with Bryony walking into the library and seeing Cecilia and Robbie together, and she's thinking, oh my God, he's attacking her, he's hurting her. Right? Okay, so chapter 11, which we read for today, a longer chapter. And in this, of course, we start to see the unfolding of events. We start to see what's happening between Robbie and Cecilia much more clearly, and how they're starting to resolve their issues. We also see the childish reaction of Bryony to what she sees in the letter, right? And so all of these events are starting to lead together, start to meld together. All right. Okay, so if we go back to the beginning of the semester, and I said to you there are some certain strategies for how to read a literary text. Remember, I said we always need to look at the context, where the text is from, who wrote it, all that sort of stuff. We also need to look at symbols and metaphors, so we've been doing that. We've been looking at things like the wildflowers, or last time I mentioned the way in which McEwan uses the light, and all those sorts of things. Today, I want to take a bit more of an in-depth look at two of the references that are in the text. Right? Remember, I said to you that literary authors use references to other stories, to other authors, to other famous characters, to famous quotations, right? And the reason that they do that is because they want us to compare what is happening in this story to the story that they are referencing, or the characters, or the ideas, or the author that they are referencing, right? So in the course of our chapter today that we looked at, there are two major and quite important references that I want to talk about in some detail, right? Because they are set up as being, as I said, comparisons between what is happening particularly to Robbie, because both of these are referenced in the course of talking about Robbie, and Robbie thinking about his own life. and also because they are used as a kind of model, if you like, for McEwan, not to just copy, but to use as a sort of a springboard, a reference point for the way in which he creates his own story. Okay. All right. So the first of these is to a character by the name of Malvolio. Right. And Malvolio is from a Shakespeare play by the name of Twelfth Night. Right. Anyone read this play? No one's read this play? Nadia, you have? Yep. Do you remember what kind of play it is? Oh, you don't have to tell us the story, but do you remember what kind of play? Like, what kind of play is Hamlet? For example, his most famous play. Tragedy, right? Is Twelfth Night a tragedy? No, it's not, right? It's a comedy, right? So Shakespeare wrote his plays in three major sort of subgenres. Tragedies, right? Because of course tragedies end badly, and they are unhappy, tragic. Comedies, which of course are meant to be funny and have happy endings. And then also a mixture of the two called tragicomedies, which are kind of sad but also funny at the same time. All right. So this particular play, Twelfth Night, is not like the very bloody, unhappy, tragic plays like Hamlet or Othello or Macbeth. Right? Doesn't fall into, or King Lear, doesn't fall into those sorts of very serious, very tragic, very unhappy kinds of plays. Instead, it falls into the category of comedy. Right? So it's meant to be funny, and it's meant to have, well, a relatively happy ending. Right? In fact, the origins of those terms, tragedy and comedy, they come to us from Greek theater, and originally comedy didn't have to be funny. It just meant happy ending. Right? Things turn out well. Tragedy, things turn out badly. So in this comedy, we see that this is not the first time in Atonement that the character of Malvolio has been mentioned. Right? So the first major look that we got in Atonement into the character of Robbie, remembering that the chapters have tended to jump back and forth between the perspectives of different characters, was in chapter 8, right? So this is, remember, chapter 8 is mostly set when Robbie is at home, right? Well, at his mother's place, but at home, amongst his books, in his room, and he is thinking through his future, his past, what he wants. He starts thinking about Cecilia, right? And all of those insights that we get into his thoughts. And in the course of those memories that he has, one of them is that when he was a student at Cambridge, joined a theatre group and played the part of Malvolio when that group put on a production of Twelfth Night. Right? So of course, this is very common. In a university, we do it here at Hanyang, right? There's a drama group, and you can go and you can produce a play. You can either be a background person who does props and lighting and other technical stuff, or you can be an actor, right? And in this case, Robbie, for the fun of it, and also because he's interested in literature, he plays the part of Malvolio, right? So we see this represented on page 77 of the published one and 43 of our course packet. At the outer reaches of the desk, various photographs. Right, so this is sort of this descriptive scene. The cast of Twelfth Night on the college lawn. Himself, Robbie, as Malvolio, cross-gartered. How apt. Right? How apt. Apt means? Apt means what? It means appropriate, right? How appropriate. Okay. So, this particular photograph of this scene, Robbie is thinking, oh, yeah, I was playing Malvolio, right? Yep, his character is like me. Right? Now, he's being a bit unfair to himself here, right? He's being quite hard on himself, in fact. But yes, he makes this comparison in his head. He sort of looks at this photograph back at himself at Cambridge playing Malvolio, and he says, yeah, I was like that idiot. Yeah, I was that stupid, right? So we'll see the full meaning of this in a moment. So who is this? What is this character in Twelfth Night like? What does he do? Why would Robbie compare himself to this character? Why would McEwan include this in here? Well, first of all, Malvolio is included by Shakespeare as the target of most of the comedy in the play, right? And that's because Malvolio has a lot of contradictions in his character. On the one hand, he's kind of puritanical. He's moralistic, right? He has these sort of views that everyone should follow this very sort of strict moral code and should be very sort of repressed and behave in a particular way. But underlying that is the fact that Malvolio, for all of his bluster about how people should follow those kinds of moral rules and that they should be this kind of way, really isn't naturally that kind of character himself, right? So that gap between what he says he believes and how his character actually is becomes the source of the comedy in the play, right? Because Malvolio turns out to be something of a hypocrite. And so the other characters in the play tend to sort of call him on his hypocrisy. They tend to show up his hypocrisy in various ways by challenging his moral rules and his moral, his supposedly moral behavior in various ways. So basically, the comedy in the play is a lot of pranks, a lot of jokes, a lot of practical tricks that they play upon Malvolio, right? Constantly teasing him about how he's so uptight while they are having all of this pleasure, right? So the central part of the plot in which the big trick that the other characters play upon Malvolio is that they know that he likes this young woman by the name of Olivia. Right? They know that he likes her, but he kind of won't admit it. So they send him a letter. Does this start to sound familiar to what's happening with Robbie, Cecilia, Bryony, sending a letter, right? So they send him a letter, a forged letter, a fake letter that pretends to be from Olivia, right? They try to copy her handwriting and they sign it as if it's from her. And it says, Malvolio, I'm secretly in love with you, right? If only you would come and see me, and I would like you to dress in this way, and I would like you to act in this way, right? In all these ways that are quite ridiculous, right? So if we go back to the quotation, right, where he says, cross-gartered. What's it? Anyone know what a garter is? Only women wear them these days. Right, it's like to hold up your stockings, or if you're back in the day, you were wearing like men's hose, like they did in medieval times. Then it's like an elastic band or a tie around the top of your leg, right, to keep your hose or your stockings or whatever you're wearing up. Okay. So in the letter, one of the things that they request of Malvolio is that he wear a particular style of what's called a cross garter, right? And that he wear a yellow one, right? And that he show it off to Olivia, right? Yellow being this very happy, over-the-top, exuberant sort of color. Now, it turns out that, of course, Olivia didn't actually ask him to do any of these things and to behave in this sort of way. And so when Malvolio turns up at Olivia's place thinking that she's in love with him and that she actually wants him to do all the things described in the letter, one of the things that he does is wear these yellow cross garters. And first of all, Olivia turns out she hates this style. That's why these jokers picked it. And she sees the yellow and she's like, my brother just died. You should be wearing black. Why are you wearing yellow? I hate this, right? So basically, all of the things that the letter tells Malvolio to do, it's like, oh, just do these things and I will love you forever, right? When he actually goes to see Olivia, she's like, what is wrong with you? You are crazy. You are nuts. I'm not interested in you, right? Why are you doing these weird things, right? And of course, in this way, Malvolio turns out to be the target of this practical joke, right? So that's why, remember the state of mind that Robbie is in chapter 8 when he's thinking about these things is right after, not long after the fountain scene, right? And Robbie is still feeling extremely uncertain about what has happened between himself and Cecilia. And he's sort of thinking about, here's this young woman that he likes, and all of a sudden there's this very strange scene where she takes off all her clothes and jumps in the fountain and then storms off with the vase. And he's starting to think, well, was this sort of like, the letter from Olivia? Was this like some sort of practical joke? Am I like a fool for going after this woman like Malvolio did after Olivia, right? So this is the kinds of parallels that McEwen is setting up by making this reference, first of all. So further on in Twelfth Night, Malvolio's behavior is seen as so strange, right? He so gets into doing all the weird things that were described in the letter that he actually gets locked up for a while, right? He gets locked up because they're like, this guy is nuts, he's crazy, he's a madman, right? And of course the comedy doesn't stop there. Then they play further tricks on him when he's locked up. And the play, towards the end, later on, he realizes that he's been tricked, and he's like, oh, I will get my revenge upon those guys. I will, I will get back at them. So, as I said, first of all, we see from chapter 8 that the comparison to Malvolio, where he's being very hard on himself, is saying, oh, I'm an idiot. I must be like Malvolio, right? Like this chasing after Cecilia, right? What am I thinking? I must be crazy. Like she can't be interested in me, right? She ignored me for 3 years at Cambridge. We grew up together. We're like brother and sister, right? And there was that really weird scene at the fountain. What was going on there, right? So and she's like, my benefactor's daughter. So all of these things are going through his head, and he's starting to wonder, am I a fool? Am I being just, an idiot like Malvolio was? Is this all some kind of practical joke? So as I mentioned too, you can see how there are these parallels being set up in chapter 8 between Malvolio and Robbie. And notice too, as I put it there, that McEwen borrows the device of the letter, right? So the practical jokers send the letter from, supposedly from Olivia to Malvolio, leading to his behavior. In this case, we see it goes in the other direction, where Robbie sends a letter, although the wrong version, to Cecilia. So you can see here, this is a painting of a romantic painting, much later than Shakespeare's time, of Malvolio playing the fool, right? Being this sort of idiot, or this, someone who is easily fooled. And you can see here, he does not look terribly intelligent. He looks like he's, somewhat been tricked and somewhat stupid. Okay. Now, in today's reading, we had a second reference to Malvolio, right? And this was on page 70 of our packet and page 122 to 3 of the published book. And the chapter, you notice, it jumps forward and backwards a little bit in time, right? So when we begin the chapter, we're sort of like opening the dinner and stuff, and then we jump back to conversation and the encounter between Robbie and Cecilia over the letter, and then we jump back into the dinner, right? So there's this time shift that occurs. And as Robbie is thinking about this, right, we have him again referencing Malvolio and thinking, well, maybe that I wasn't so foolish after all, right? Because remember, it turns out that Cecilia is not as offended by the letters as he expected, that actually it's made her realize how much she actually does like Robbie. And so he explains it after this passage. So it says here, and this was no fantasy, this was real. This was his near future, both desirable and unavoidable. But that was what wretched Malvolio thought, whose part he had played once on the college lawn. And then he quotes from the play. Nothing can come between me and the full prospect of my hopes, right? So remember before in the first reference in chapter 8, we see Robbie is still extremely uncertain as to the status of the relationship between himself and Cecilia. And he's thinking, am I just an idiot? Right? Am I just a fool? Is this just all in my imagination that Cecilia could possibly want me? This time, however, he seems to be saying, well, I could still be an idiot. I could still be Malvolio, but from the conversation I just had with Cecilia, how could it, it seems like that's impossible, right? He says that this is the near future, right? I've talked to Cecilia, he's talked to Cecilia, and he knows that after this dinner, after the social obligations are done, that they're going to get together, right? He knows that they sort of have declared this to each other. And so he's thinking, like, surely nothing could happen now that would stop me from getting to be with Cecilia. Surely nothing would stop me from now, like it's going to happen, right? After this dinner, Cecilia and I are going to meet up, and we're going to be together. So he's thinking this way, and the shift occurs in the reference to Malvolio. Now we know, as it says there, that in chapter 10, Bryony walks in on Robbie and Cecilia in the library, right? And this scene is further elaborated on a bit more in the chapter today that we read, right? We see more clearly how they got to the library and what happens there. Right? And it's, in this case, it's Bryony, not as a practical joke, right? But for other reasons, that she ends up interrupting the scene, right? So McEwan, as I said, he takes this character of Malvolio, he takes a lot of the ideas and scenarios from Twelfth Night, but he's not just doing it for the sake of copying what Shakespeare is doing, right? Notice that he changes around a lot of the things. The direction of the letter, for example, is different. The letter is a different, accidentally sort of wrong version instead of a forgery. And as it says there, we can see that, in the case of Malvolio, it's meant to be for the sake of comedy, even though it's kind of, they really are pretty mean to poor old Malvolio. But nonetheless, Shakespeare's version is a comedy, right? Whereas we can see that Bryony is not doing this for the sake of comedy, right? She's doing this out of her sort of childish spite and resentment. Okay, so that's the first of the two references that I wanted to talk about today. So that first one to Malvolio occurs first of all in chapter 8 and now is referenced again in chapter 11 from today. The second reference is that of a famous novel by D.H. Lawrence called Lady Chatterley's Lover. You can see, I taught this a couple of semesters ago in my graduate class, and Lawrence is one of my favorite writers, although I'm not so crazy about this particular book. But D.H. Lawrence, and remember again, when we think about these references, context, knowing the choice, why that you would choose these kinds of writers, right? D.H. Lawrence, you know his background? You know anything about him? Well, D.H. Lawrence is kind of unusual in the history of British literature because most authors have tended to come from either upper class, rich, aristocratic backgrounds, or at least middle class, right, backgrounds. Whereas D.H. Lawrence, by contrast, was the son of a poor coal miner, right? Pretty much the lowest sort of like job and status you could have in society, right? So he grew up in a very poor, very working class kind of family. And it was both because his mother was very ambitious, the rise of public education in Great Britain, right, which allowed him to learn to read and write and so on. And also the fact that, unlike his brothers, D.H. Lawrence was quite a sort of sickly person, right? He wasn't, robust and healthy like his brothers who went on to be coal miners. Instead, he had health problems that he suffered from all of his life. He eventually died at only 44 from complications of tuberculosis. So, nonetheless, Lawrence he was born in the late 19th century, but he became famous in the early 20th century as a writer who was interested, first of all, in nature, but not the kind of nature that the Romantics were interested in, right? And this is where we can see a very similar pattern to what we talked about with the wildflowers, right? Where the thing about the wildflowers that we talked about with Cecilia earlier is that, the version of nature that she's trying to create with the vase and the flower arrangement is a kind of fake nature, trying to make them look natural even though the arrangement of the flowers is artificial. And this was a big part of Lawrence's criticism of the literature of the 19th century, particularly of the Romantics, right? He said their version of nature and what nature is comes from up here, right? From their imaginations, from things that they can control. Whereas, he says our real nature comes to us from the body, right? From our blood, from our senses, from our nerves, right? From the things that we actually feel, okay? So it's this sort of physical part of Lawrence that he emphasizes in his works, right? And if you read his stories and you read his novels and his poems, one of the things that really stands out is has a very amazing ability to describe the emotional shifts that occur between people, right? Especially in like close relations, like between close friends or between lovers, and the way he's able to describe their physical body language in as much detail as he's able to describe or report their dialogue, right? So he has a very strong emphasis upon the physical, upon the way in which, like, our bodies and our, just our instincts rather than our conscious mind are an important part of us that he argues we've tended to forget about in the modern world, where we think too much to the point where even nature, even sex, even eating, all of those physical functions, we think about them rather than experience them, right? Their full vitality. So this work in particular, though, is chosen by McEwan for a number of reasons. The first is that, remember, the setting of our story, right, is in 1935. And we've talked about how this is important for a number of historical reasons. It's right before World War II. It's during the rise of Nazism. It's during the Great Depression, even though we don't see, right? It seems the Great Depression seems almost absent from this because the Tallases are a rich, successful family. So there's not that kind of like grinding poverty and unemployment that we see. There's really the reality of Great Britain at this time. And also we've seen things like the status of women as being important for this time. But here's another dimension that we see, is that the culture and the approach to ideas about like public morality are reflected in the way in which the people of this time and the laws of this time treated a novel like Lady Chatterley's Lover, which is to say that when it was published in Italy, not in England. Right? Now, Lawrence had spent lots of time living and traveling in Italy, but nonetheless, it wasn't first published in Great Britain, it was first published in Italy. And it was banned by law in Great Britain. So you could not just, today, you can see my copy is the Penguin 20th Century Classics, right? It's classic, you should be reading this, like this is a famous novel. But in Robbie's time, in the time that this is set, this book is banned, right? And we actually see that for him to get a copy, right? The original edition is called the Orioli edition, after the publisher in Florence who helped Lawrence to publish it originally, right? And so people were smuggling in copies of Lady Chatterley's Lover. And guess what kinds of places that they were selling it? Bookstores? No. Where do you think? Like places that sell illegal things, things like pornography and so on, right? So when it says there that he bought it under the counter in Soho, right, it means that Soho is a famous part of London, right? And under the counter means that he bought it secretly. He bought it at the idea, like the figure of speech comes from that people used to literally sort of sell it to you under the counter, right? We also use this term when people get paid cash, and so they don't pay any taxes. So if you pay someone under the counter, it means you just pay them cash, and then they don't have to pay any tax on that. Right? So in this case, Lawrence's story, Lawrence's ideas in this novel are banned, right? So 1928 is when it's published. 1935 is when our story is set. Still banned, still illegal, still considered pornography, And it wasn't until 1960, right, that the text of Lady Chatterley's Lover was allowed to be published in Great Britain, right? So for a good 32 years, you could not buy this famous novel, the last novel that D.H. Lawrence published, in a bookstore. Okay. So the reason was a number of things. First of all, Lawrence had talked about sex and the relationship between men and women and gender and all sorts of things like this before in his work. But in Lady Chatterley's Lover, he was very explicit about it, right? The novel contains like direct sex scenes in a way that, that actually, if we read them today, they seem quite tame, right? They don't seem all that shocking. But for 1928, apparently, it was shocking to talk directly about sex and about sexuality. In addition, it wasn't just the fact that the book contained sex scenes. It was that it talked about sex and about marriage and about adultery and about the relationships between men and women in a way that was considered very subversive for that time, right? Let's take a look at the story and see why that might be. Well, the story itself, the woman of the title, the heroine of the title, is a young woman by the name of Constance. And she gets married to a guy who is, has a knighthood, so he's Sir Clifford Chatterley. And Sir Clifford, even though he's not actually physically harmed by his time in World War I, by his serving in World War I, he has a traumatic experience during that war. And he is crippled, right? He has to get around everywhere in a wheelchair. He can't use his legs from the hips downwards, right? So his legs and all the rest of his body is not actually physically damaged, but his mind locks up in this way. He's so traumatized by what happens to him that he loses the use of his legs. Constance meets Clifford, and she's very charmed by him. She doesn't want to follow the usual boring life as she sees it of her friends who are getting married and having children and just being ordinary housewives. And so she becomes part of a sort of an intellectual circle of people who read philosophy and literature and have ideas. And because Clifford is part of this circle, she's charmed by him and she falls in love with him and they get married. But because Clifford is in this wheelchair, because of his trauma, he's not able to sleep with his wife. He's not able to consummate the marriage. Right? So basically they're living in this sexless marriage, but Constance hopes that the marriage nonetheless can be sustained by their intellect, by their discussions, by their interest in books and reading and talking to other intellectuals, and she thinks, maybe this is enough, right? This is all I need. Maybe sex isn't all that important to the marriage. Right. So remembering what I said earlier about Lawrence's philosophy, where he says, we tend to live too much up here and not enough in the body. We tend to think too much about even things that we're supposed to experience directly. Well, this changes when Constance meets Oliver Mellors, and he's the sort of like the caretaker of their grounds, the gamekeeper, as he's called. Right? It's a common sort of job back in those times. And that was to sort of, they would do things like repair fences and sort of look after animals and do all sorts of odd jobs around the grounds that needed to be done, right? Sort of a handyman who looks after the property, okay, or a caretaker. Constance starts to talk to Mellors starts to have conversations with him, and eventually this leads to a sexual relationship with Mellors, right? And remembering that, within her marriage, that Constance is not having any sort of relationships like this with Clifford. And this relationship with Mellors, who is both, on the one hand, they have this sexual relationship, on the other hand, they are also able to talk together about these intellectual things as well at the same time, leads Constance to realize, well, actually maybe my marriage to Clifford isn't what it should be, right? That you can't just sustain a marriage just upon the intellect alone. You have to have both the physical and the intellectual or spiritual connection, right? So just like with Shakespeare, right, McEwan chooses this little reference for a particular reason, right? Not that he's going to retell the story of Lady Chatterley's lover in Atonement, but he's going to borrow certain elements from it, right? So we can see that, first of all, there are certain class elements that occur both within Lady Chatterley's lover and the relationship between Robbie and Cecilia. What position did Robbie's father occupy in the Tallis household? His gardener, caretaker, right? So very similar kind of position to a gamekeeper, right? So in this case, Robbie is like the son of the gamekeeper, right? And so there is a kind of parallel here between him and Mellors, right? And notice too that even though we're told that, we're told that Robbie's relationship with Cecilia and her brother was that he was sort of accepted, adopted almost, as one of the family, right? So they treat him a lot of the time like a brother. And of course, he's also given this scholarship to go to Cambridge by Jack Tallis, the father, right? So there are certain ways in which the Tallises have adopted him into their family, but nonetheless, there's still a class difference, isn't there? Right? And this is one of the things that is commented on several times in the course of the story already. So remember back to when Cecilia is talking about Robbie taking off his socks, for example. And she thinks that he is trying to make fun of the class difference between them. He's like, oh, he thinks I'm this lady, this snob, and he's just the working class boy, right? So class is a very important thing in British culture and society. And it's something that we'll come back to talk about, particularly with regard to the history of the Tallis family and how they occupy a very sort of unusual, strange position with regard to class in the novel. Because even though they are rich and successful, they're not a long-standing, aristocratic family that stretches back generations and generations, right? They're new money, right? They're new in this position of being upper class. So there is this disparity in class that you can see between Cecilia and Robbie that is also reflected in Lawrence's interest in the way in which she is Lady Chatterley, right? She has this aristocratic title. She's from an upper middle class family, whereas Mellors is this man of the earth, of the dirt, of the grounds, of nature. One other thing too that as I was rereading this, I hadn't thought about this before, but is that the style in which the scene in the library, as it's described in this chapter, chapter 11, is actually extremely similar to the style that Lawrence uses in all of his writing. Right? And that Lawrence's writing, the focus of most of his stories is not upon plot, right? It's not upon like unfolding something exciting that's building up or that's leading in a particular direction. Instead, it's usually exploring the relationships between people. And the way in which he does this is that he often gives us dialogue between those characters, right? So a man and a woman who are lovers, or husband and wife, or let's say Constance and Clifford, or Constance talking to Mellors, right? We'll have these scenes where we get short bits of dialogue, right? Like we see in the scene with the library, right? So, you know, when Cecilia is talking to Robbie about receiving the letter, she sort of is like, I got your letter. He's like, I know, sorry. You know, and like these bits of dialogue are very short, but wedged in between those bits of dialogue, we get lots of insight into the body language, into the thoughts, into the ideas that are flowing between the two characters, right? So notice that in the midst of this dialogue, as Robbie and Cecilia become more intimate, we see that like there's this sort of awkwardness that's described, and then they start to feel better. And like, so the narrator goes into these very long descriptive passages that are wedged in between these little bits of dialogue. It's classic Lawrence's style, right? It's exactly like D.H. Lawrence's style. So here, and we'll see there are other parts of the story of Atonement where McEwan does this with other writers, where he borrows from the style from other writers and other famous techniques of writing. And he will insert them into the style of Atonement, right? Like he does here with Lawrence. Okay, so these are, So these are the two main references that I picked out for discussion from my part today, from my side today. Malvolio from Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, which we've seen McEwan borrows certain elements but also changes certain elements. Lady Chatterley's Lover, in which, again, McEwan borrows Lawrence's style, borrows some of the ideas, borrows some of the basic structure, right? The class structure, for example. It's no accident that it occurs during like the novel's sex scene, basically, that he chooses Lawrence for this, given the fame of Lady Chatterley's Lover. And so these two references are quite important for understanding this part of the text. Okay, so now let's turn to your homework and see what are some of the ideas that you engaged with this time. Yunhe, why don't you start us off today? Okay, well, we are out of time for today. Thank you, guys, and please hand in your prep sheets, and I will see you on next Monday for the next section.